Hello and welcome to this week's video. It is on thermoregulation. And again, just to recap, we're talking about homeostasis, which comes from the Greek words same and steady, and it refers to any process that living things use to actively maintain fairly stable conditions that are necessary for survival. So the learning goals for today are: firstly, to identify and explain the varying thermoregulatory mechanisms of endotherms and how they control heat exchange and metabolic activity in terms of a few things. So we're going to talk about structural features, we're going to talk about behavioral responses, physiological mechanisms, and lastly, homeostatic mechanisms. So you can pause the video here and just write a quick summarized version of those learning goals. Cool, so let's get into it then. We're talking about balancing heat loss and gain. This is just an overarching introduction to why do we need thermoregulation to survive anyway. So a few more questions is, why do lizards sunbathe? And if you've ever seen a jackrabbit, they're these little creatures that live in desert-like conditions and they have these huge ears. Same with elephants. Why? Why do dogs pant when they're hot? What does that do? Animals have quite a few different ways to regulate body temperature. And like I just mentioned, these thermoregulatory strategies let them live in different environments, including some that are pretty extreme. So as a refresher, organisms can be divided into either endotherms or ectotherms, and it's based on their temperature regulation. So endotherms, such as birds and lizards, birds and mammals, not lizards, use a metabolic heat to maintain a stable internal temperature, often one different from the environment. And you can see that it doesn't really matter what the outside temperature is, except for in the extreme cases. There's quite a stable temperature going on there, as opposed to ectotherms. And we're looking at snakes, we're looking at lizards. They do not use metabolic heat to maintain their body temp, but they take on the temperature of their environment. So as the temperature increases, so does that animal's internal temperature. We're going to have a closer look at some strategies, some behavioral strategies, physiological processes, and even just anatomical features that help animals to regulate their body temperature. Even in endotherms, different organisms have slightly different core temperatures where their enzymes work most efficiently. If temperatures rise above that set point, then those enzymes, you would remember, denature. Metabolic processes, that's all the processes required for survival, then begin to fail, and that individual will either suffer hyperthermia if temperatures rise, or if they drop too low, again, enzymes can't function optimally, so the body begins to shut down, and that's called hypothermia. We are regulating our body temperature all the time, either heating ourselves up or cooling ourselves down as endotherms to be able to maintain stable body temperatures that are required for survival. So how do we know what our temperature is? We have a few different ways of picking this up, but I'm going to go on to one key one right now, and it's in our brain. So here's a diagram of our brain, and there's this little section called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is located on the undersurface of the brain. It lies just below the thalamus and above the pituitary gland, which we've spoken about in the endocrine, the hormonal system. It's attached by a stalk, that's the brainstem. It is an extremely complex part of the brain containing many regions with highly specialized functions. In humans, the hypothalamus is very small. It's approximately the size of a pea and accounts for less than 1% of the weight of the brain, but it's so important. One of the major functions of the hypothalamus is, you guessed it, to maintain homeostasis. That's to keep the human body in a stable, constant condition. The hypothalamus is a section of your brain that controls thermoregulation. It does that by monitoring the temperature of our blood. If it's becoming too low or too high, it sends signals to our muscles, our organs, our glands, and our nervous system to respond in a variety of different ways, and we'll look at that soon. So that's an extremely important part in our body in terms of thermoregulation, but let's move on. So first up, we're going to talk about structural features. That's like anatomical features that allow an organism to maintain homeostasis through thermoregulation. So first up, animals have different body structures that control how much heat they exchange with their environment, such as fur, fat, or feathers that provide insulation, like a blanket or a jumper. Another way to minimize heat loss to the environment is through this insulation. So we're talking about birds having feathers and fluffing themselves up, as you can see over here. We're talking about how mammals use hair or fur to trap a layer of air next to the skin, and that reduces heat transfer with the environment as well. Similarly, marine animals like whales, like seals, they use blubber, this thick layer of fat, as a heavy-duty form of insulation because they especially need it. Unlike other bears which hibernate, the polar bear is active throughout the winter. So they need to be able to keep warm without just burrowing themselves into the ground or in a cave or just sleeping for most of it. And they can do this because they have a few structural features which supports this. Primarily, they have a really thick layer of fat tissue. Another word for fat tissue is adipose tissue. It's brown adipose tissue. If you shaved a polar bear, they're not white underneath. Their skin is this really dark color. And this brown adipose tissue is about 11.5 centimeters thick. It insulates and helps generate metabolic heat. So here we can see this is the fat tissue on a seal. It's even thicker in polar bears, and this is a microscopic image of brown adipose tissue, and it's packed. It's all this fat, and it's packed out with little mitochondria, and we'll talk about that in a sec. It's so richly endowed with blood vessels and mitochondria because, as you will know, mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. They turn sugar and all that into energy, and as a byproduct of metabolism is heat. This tissue is specialized for rapid heat production, and babies actually can't shiver, so they need to be able to keep warm in different ways, and that's why they also have all these baby rolls, this baby fat. In cold weather, birds fluff their feathers, and animals raise their fur to thicken the insulating layer. We do something similar as humans. We have goosebumps, but it's not so effective, so that's why we tend not to live in extremely cold conditions. Contrary to keeping blood away from the surface, to thermoregulate also means sometimes we're going to want to lose our heat. So features of organisms which live in hot conditions, who don't want to overheat, they have blood vessels located really close to the skin where a lot of heat is in the blood, so that heat can easily diffuse out, and that's why jackrabbits have these really big ears with large surface area ears to diffuse heat. This is a cute little video on YouTube if you haven't watched it. I'll put the link in the description. It's this little baby polar bear and it gets scared by a seal. It's pretty cute. So these are structural adaptations that help an organism to survive. We've spoken about brown adipose tissue, talked about packed with mitochondria, generate heat, and basically just insulation in general. So if we keep going on, instead of talking about structural adaptations now, we're going to talk about behavior responses. So these are things that an organism chooses to do to stay alive, to stay well. So how do we regulate our body temperature using behavior? Well, on a hot day, we might go for a swim or drink cold water or sit in the shade, or on a cold day, you might put on a coat or sit by a fire, eat a bowl of soup, have a cup of tea. But non-human animals have similar types of behaviors. For instance, elephants, they spray themselves with water to cool down on a hot day. And many animals seek shade when they get too warm. On the other hand, lizards often bask on a hot rock to warm up, and penguin chicks huddle in a group to retain heat. This type of behavior, when you see penguins just huddling, it has this special word, and it's called kleptothermy. Some animals respond to environmental cues by slowing down their metabolic processes. So metabolism, it actually takes energy for all that to happen to, and so and it also produces heat, and they can lose that heat. So one way in which organisms survive is by simply slowing down their metabolic activity, like slowing down all their life processes, and it's entering this sleepy state known as torpor. And torpor is like this decreased activity state, decreased metabolism that allows animals to survive unfavorable conditions and to conserve energy. It may be used for long periods, but torpor, T-O-R-P-O-R, is generally in reference to shorter times of decreased activity to conserve heat. But extended periods of torpor refers to when animals go into hibernation. That's a state in which they slow their metabolism and maintain a reduced body temperature during the winter. That's an extended period of time, quite a few months. Cues that cause animals to either enter hibernation include when it drops in temperature or the shortening of days. Some animals enter an extended period of torpor even during the summer months. So again, it might be very hot and again unfavorable. And there could be little water. So in this case, the extended torpor is called estivation. That's the term up here. Some desert animals estivate in response to dry conditions, and this shift helps them survive in the harshest months of the year. Torpor, as we said, it generally refers to just short periods of this kind of hibernation, and it can either be sporadic or daily. So in response to unfavorable conditions in the heat of the day, they can enter into this pattern. Small endotherms, such as like these mice that live in the desert, they reduce the amount of energy they need, and thus food they consume, by entering torpor during the part of the day that is the coldest, when they would otherwise need to use a lot of energy to produce metabolic heat and maintain body temperature. And there's this really cool video of this guy out in the desert, and he finds this cute little mouse. It obviously had burrowed itself down into the ground and entered into this state of torpor, but maybe the conditions, the wind or something, have flicked it out, and he just found it upon the road, I think it is. But he knows how to warm it up, how to wake it up by warming it up. So this just a cool little video in the link that shows how he does it as well. So he knows what he's doing. So we've spoken about structural features, behavioral responses, and we just have a couple more. So let's talk about physiological mechanisms. So this is something that, again, happens within the body, but instead of it being a behavior, a choice, is something that happens involuntary. So these physiological responses control how much heat an organism exchanges with its environment, and it involves the circulatory system, altering blood flow, but it also involves like evaporative mechanisms. That's the process of evaporation, such as panting and sweating, to cool down. So in endotherms, that's us, warm blood from the body's core typically loses heat to the environment as it passes near the skin, shrinking the diameter of blood vessels that therefore supply the skin with blood, known as vasoconstriction, therefore reduces blood flow to the skin and helps retain heat. On the other hand, when an endotherm needs to get rid of heat, say after running hard to escape a predator or after some intense exercise, these blood vessels get wider or dilate. That's called vasodilation, and vasodilation increases blood flow to the skin and helps therefore that heat from the blood escape from the skin to the outside environment. Many birds and animals have taken advantage of this process, and it's called countercurrent exchange. So we've spoken about this in terms of fish getting oxygen in and CO2 out into their blood, but it's also used in thermoregulations, and you can see in this diagram of say an Arctic bird's, like a penguin's foot here, how it does this. So it's really thin, their feet, and so if they just look like lost a lot of heat in their blood as their feet are touching the ice, it's going to get quite cold, and it would take a lot of energy just to maintain that. So they basically like just pay the cost of having cold feet, but where they can't have cold blood is when it returns to the core. So it uses this process where the heat from the upper part of the foot, it actually heats the blood as it returns to the core, but it doesn't really matter when it gets too cold down here. So that's how animals have countercurrent heat exchanges to maintain body temperature. Endotherms have another way of looking after their metabolic heat, or their internal core temperature, by generating heat in response to cold environments. And this is, if you generate something like the beginning, creating, there's this term called genesis. So it's called thermogenesis or thermogenesis, when an organism generates heat in response to its cold environment. And one way we can do this is by shivering, because shivering increases like energy expenditure, and when we generate energy, byproduct is heat. It's very costly though, so we can't keep it up for a long period of time. It takes a lot of energy to do that. So other processes include sweating and panting, like in this picture of the dog and sweating on the skin. What it does is it just increases like the surface area on the tongue when it sticks it out, where that moisture can evaporate from the tongue. And moisture on the tongue is highly vascularized. That moisture, when it evaporates, takes that heat out of the blood, off the body, into the outside environment. Dogs pant really quickly because they also are getting rid of heat in their like in their bronchioles and in their respiratory surfaces in the same process. And when we sweat as humans, dogs can't sweat, that's why they pant. We don't really pant, that's why we sweat. Same process. When heat evaporates the sweat off our skin, it takes the heat from our body with it. That's why it's really hard to sweat on a humid day, because it's just a really low concentration gradient. That moisture doesn't really go anywhere, it just stays on our skin. Yeah, so that's a few physiological mechanisms. We spoke about vasomotor control, evaporative heat loss, countercurrent exchange, thermogenesis, such as shivering. And one last one that we'll talk about is homeostatic mechanisms. So homeostatic mechanisms, we're talking in terms of hormones now. So two hormones I want to talk about. That is, I want to talk about like insulin and glucagon, but also to do with the thyroid. So if you read chapter 12.4 of your textbook, there will be a deeper, a better explanation of this. But basically, one way in which we can maintain thermoregulate our body temp is through the thyroid system. And so we have environmental factors such as temperature. The hypothalamus picks up that maybe increasing or decreasing temperature of our blood in our brain. And then what that does is the hypothalamus, it releases this hormone, and it's called TRH, and that stands for thyrotropin releasing hormone. And that is a hormone produced by the hypothalamus that activates another gland. That's the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland then releases what's called TSH, and that's thyroid stimulating hormone. And so that, therefore, as the name suggests, stimulates the thyroid gland, and that's this gland in the neck that secretes these hormones, such as thyroxine. And thyroxine now travels throughout the body to all the cells, where it therefore has an effect on our metabolic processes. Do we need to slow down our metabolic processes and our heat generation, or do we need to pick it up? So either way, it's a negative feedback, and it's counteracting what we're picking up. So that pathway is the hypothalamus picks up our change in blood temp, that releases TRH that acts upon the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. that releases TSH. It stimulates the thyroid, which stimulates the release of thyroxine, which acts upon our body cells. Another way in which we can regulate our body temp is in terms of our blood and our glucose levels. So in this diagram here, we have just up the top, so blood glucose concentration rises. So maybe you've just had a really sugary meal. We can't have too much sugar in our blood. We need to put that into our cells. And so the pancreas secretes more insulin and less glucagon. And insulin takes sugar out of our blood into our cells, where it can then either be used, or if it doesn't need to be used, if we've got enough of it, we can store it. And we store it by converting it into glycogen. So therefore, blood glucose concentration falls, and we have our optimum BGL, blood glucose level. But say if we go down here and we have blood glucose concentration falls, maybe this period of starvation, then pancreas secretes less insulin and more glucagon. And cells convert, so glucagon is important for taking that stored energy, that glycogen, and converts it back into this usable form, glucose, and releases it into the bloodstream to therefore go into the bloodstream to all the cells that need it. Therefore, blood glucose concentration rises, and we get this optimal point. What does that have anything to do with thermoregulation? Well, when we get sugar into our cells, that's the process of metabolism and breaking that sugar down into energy. And remember, the byproduct of energy is heat. So we can also use insulin and glucagon to maintain homeostasis in terms of thermoregulation. And that is all for today. So just a summary of all that, we have structural features, that's insulation, brown adipose tissue, even shape and size, so less diffusion here, small surface area to volume ratio, as opposed to something with like really big flappy ears or something. But we can also have choices, behavioral responses such as huddling together, that's kleptothermy. Also torpor, entering into this state of decreased metabolic activity. Then physiological mechanisms, things that happen involuntary, such as the dilation or the constriction of blood vessels, and also countercurrent heat exchange processes. Thermogenesis just means the generation of heat that can be through physiological mechanisms such as shivering. Then lastly, we looked at homeostatic mechanisms, so that's feedback models. We spoke about the negative feedback loop involving the hypothalamus, the thyroid, but also insulin and glucagon, so we're talking the pancreas there. And that is all for today. So if you jump into your textbooks and look at chapter 12, add keywords to your glossary. I hope that this video has been informative and helpful. God bless, guys. I'll see you in class. Bye.